Speaker.
Sue Keedgley.
Yes, the Green Party, as in other parties, supports the local government borrowing bill, though with some misgivings, and we will be listening carefully at select committee stages and seeing if our concerns can be addressed as to whether we will continue to support it. I mean, on first looking at the bill, it certainly makes some sense to set up a New Zealand local government funding agency which will be able to issue debt and raise finance on behalf of local governments and become a sort of large-scale borrower, hopefully get a high credit rating and thereby a lower interest rate so that local councils will be able to borrow more cost-effectively and the agency will be able to lend on more favourable terms than those that would normally apply. So there is merit in that proposal. There is merit too in allowing councils to come together in this way cooperatively to fund large infrastructure projects. We're pleased that it is an opt-in arrangement. Councils aren't forced to go to this agency to borrow money. They can do so if they wish. And, you know, there are, as the previous speaker said, there's a lot of large infrastructure projects in local government that do need funding, not to mention the Christchurch earthquake, rail projects, etc. And so spreading the risk over several generations does make a certain amount of sense. We do have some concerns, however, about allowing the Auckland Council to borrow in foreign currency, which it is presently prohibited from doing so under the Local Government Act. And we need to remember, I mean, I think we fear that there could be some unintended consequences here because the effect of this local government borrowing bill could be to encourage borrowing, even more borrowing amongst local councils. We need to remember that the Asian financial crisis of 1998, one of the main reasons for it was when large entities and organisations in Asia borrowed offshore to finance their domestic activities, and when the exchange rates fell, they were left insolvent. And we could see, you know, we are fearful that we could see similar things happening here in New Zealand with councils, the Auckland Council, encouraged to borrow offshore while our currency is strong. What happens if the currency falls? We hope that wouldn't happen, but these are the sort of risks that are attendant on encouraging the Auckland Council to borrow in foreign currency. We notice that the Treasury impact statement did refer to some risks from borrowing in foreign currencies, but they didn't actually spell out what those obvious risks were. It's never really been spelled out, but we do have considerable concerns about that, and we will be addressing those concerns in select committee. Another concern we have is that we were given a briefing by Cameron Partners Investment Bankers, and they came along and gave us a presentation to try to encourage our support for this bill. But when we looked at the fine print, we noticed it said at the end, in each case, public consultation will be required for borrowing money, and then there was a little asterisk which said, unless borrowing less than $20 million. So in other words, what we understand from this is that any council would be able to borrow $19 million, $19.9 million, without public consultation. Now, this is a huge concern to us. This actual provision is not spelled out as far as we can see in the bill, but it was admitted in our briefing by Cameron Partners. So this is something that we will be quizzing in the Select Committee very closely, because I think it would be completely unacceptable to allow councils to borrow up to $20 million without having to go through public consultation. It would be a further erosion of the public consultation provisions of the Local Government Act. We note that, that it seems to be particularly set up, this bill, to encourage the Auckland Council to borrow, not only in foreign currency, but to borrow. And we have huge concerns about the Auckland super city, which, as far as we can see, is not local government at all. It's a form of state government. It represents a third of New Zealand's population, 1.3 million people, and it has constituencies, the councillors have constituencies which are larger than the constituencies of members in this parliament. So it's not a form of local government at all. In fact, we've erased local government in the Auckland Council, and instead we have a form of state government. And we've also managed cleverly under the Minister of Local Government, Rodney Hyde, to transfer almost all of the assets of Auckland into these council-controlled organisations, CCOs, which are essentially corporations which are outside of the democratic control of the council. Effectively, they meet, they've now got the odd public meeting, but basically they meet behind closed doors, they operate, they function like corporate boards, and the councillors, the democratically elected councillors, are not able to directly have a say in how the 80% of the assets that have been hived off into these CCOs are run. So now we have with this bill, coming back to this bill, we now will allow these CCOs, these council-controlled organisations which meet behind closed doors, to borrow and borrow in foreign currency. And also they'll be able to borrow up to $20 million without having to bother, as far as we can see from our briefing paper, without having to bother to inform the people of Auckland. Already the $28 billion of assets of Auckland have been hived off into the so-called super city, the state government that is the Auckland Council. And really the whole Auckland Council has been corporatised and basically it's been siphoned off into corporations which are controlling and making the decisions about virtually all of the assets of Auckland. So we have serious misgivings about the ability now under this bill to allow the Auckland Council to borrow in foreign currency, because it won't be the Auckland Council at all. It will effectively be these people, these directors sitting in these corporate boards, meeting in secret. They'll be able to borrow without public consultation. They'll be able to borrow in foreign currencies. They will be encouraged by this bill to borrow in foreign currencies. And so we are worried that this bill could have unintended consequences. And it reminds me somewhat of a bill that was before this House last week, which was the Leaky Homes Bill. And in this House, all of the members of the National and Labour Party voted for a bill which deregulated the entire the entire building industry, wiped away all the regulations and controls, and just gave it over to the market. And everyone supported it and said what a wonderful thing this would be, and they didn't realise the unintended consequences. They said that was going to save money, and here we are 20 years later with a $20 billion bill as a $20 billion bill as a result of that piece of legislation. So I worry that this piece of legislation could similarly have unintended consequences, and that we could be standing up and saying, why did we encourage our councils to borrow, and particularly the Auckland Council, to borrow in foreign currency? And we could find ourselves, I hope we won't find ourselves facing up to a series of crises such as happened in Asia and in other places where the currency suddenly fell. The council could easily become indebted, and of course the Crown is not liable, so it could be the citizens of Auckland who could find themselves up to their eyeballs in debt as a result of this bill.
Speaker.